The time is at hand.
From the land between the crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, you're in Dark Places. This is the second part of our UFO Cover-up series, the UFO Cover-up Part 2. Are UFOs illusions, delusions, or alien craft? The U.S. government set up several research projects to find the answer, but as Jenny Randles reveals, the attitude of the investigators was often far from objective. Thanks, Jenny. Dr. Jacques Vallée, pioneer UFO researcher, once remarked that he had been struck by the fact that in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the entry for an identified flying object falls between unicorn and unified field theory. This seemed, he added, an apt location for the UFO phenomenon. It also sums up the dilemma that has faced the United States government and scientists since the flying saucer mystery first came to the notice of the public in June of 1947. Is it something magical, like the unicorn, or a scientific problem? When UFO reports first began to flood in, the responsibility for the investigation was handed over to the U.S. Air Force. Apparently, technological devices were roaming the skies, and the origin of such devices was naturally suspect. Nobody asked, what are these phenomena? Everyone assumed that they were machines, and the only question worth asking was, where did they come from? Although reports of flying saucers started coming in 1947, few people realized that reports of bizarre objects in the sky were not new. There had been the airship sightings in the U.S. Midwest in 1896 and 1897, and later in Europe, the Foo Fighters, seen during the Second World War, and the ghost rockets in Scandinavia immediately after it. Dr. C.C. Wiley of the University of Iowa was quick to condemn the flying saucer phenomenon as mass hysteria. Columbia University's astronomer Jan Schlitt said the objects were caused by a speeding aircraft turning up the atmosphere and disturbing the light rays. And one of the first theories tested by the U.S. Air Force was that the saucers were gliding hailstones. Yeah. The public joined in the UFO jamboree, buying UFO souvenirs and hoax discs to place in neighbors' gardens. But an opinion poll in August of 1947 showed that most people believed that UFOs were simply misidentified everyday objects. Virtually nobody thought they came from outer space. One psychologist summed up the mood of the day by saying that the only question remaining was, is it an illusion based on something objective, or a delusion based on nothing tangible at all? Fearing UFOs to be secret weapons, the Technical Intelligence Division of the Air Materiel Command was asked to collect reports at Wright Field, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, in Dayton, Ohio. On September 23, 1947, just 3 months into the UFO craze, Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, the AMC commander, wrote to the commanding officer of the U.S. Army Air Force saying, "The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious." He recommended a full-scale investigation. So, as the world laughed, the U.S. Air Force issued its orders, and Project Sign came into being during January 1948. It is worth noting that for many years, the U.S. Air Force denied the existence of Twining's letter, with its unequivocal stance, just one of the many instances in which they suppressed sensitive documents that went against the official line that UFOs did not exist. By mid-1948, Sign had rejected the secret weapons hypothesis. Yet UFOs continued to display unquestionable evidence of being physical craft. This created two schools of thought. One said that all UFOs are real, but only in the sense that they were misidentified. The other argued that the objects were alien in origin. The alien hypothesis was undoubtedly the most popular, and Sign's estimate of situation report favored the alien theory. Chief of Staff General Hoyt S. Vandenberg responded by classifying the report as top secret, It was rejected by the U.S. Air Force, and shortly afterwards, it was destroyed. The rebuff had a demoralizing effect on the staff of Project Sign. However, they continued to check out UFO reports, using advanced techniques and employing scientific consultants. Their final report in February of 1947 recorded that 20% of the cases reported to them remained unexplained, and they recommended an intensified full-time U.S. Air Force study into the UFO question. Project Grudge, Sign's aptly named successor, aimed to eliminate the troublesome problem of UFOs. Positive support was offered to any journalist willing to write an article proclaiming UFOs as nonsense. This was an extraordinary change in policy. Scarcely a year separated the Sign report, which had promoted the alien theory, and the final report of Project Grudge, August of 1949, which recommended that UFO study should be greatly downgraded. In fact, Grudge had actually received 23% more reports than Sign, but had dismissed them all as being psychological. But was the Sign report really ignored at high level, or was it secretly acted upon? There are many who regard the events of the year between Sign's report and the closure of Grudge as inexplicable, except that the possibility of the UFO's alien origin was taken so seriously that responsibility for UFO study was given top-level rating, with Grudge and its successors merely acting as puppets, or public relation fronts. When Grudge was shut down in 1950, a highly secret study called Project Twinkle began. This set out to investigate reports of curious green fireballs seen in New Mexico. Scientific observation posts were set up where most fireballs had been seen, but the phenomenon moved elsewhere. When investigators followed, the UFOs moved again. One of two scientists asked for funds to investigate the odd behavior, but they were turned down, and Twinkle ceased operations. However, green fireballs of the same type continued to be seen throughout the world. In May of 1978, a former Royal Air Force pilot reported seeing 3 of them whiz past his car in Lymm, Cheshire. The era of allegations of cover-up dawned. The U.S. Air Force pursued a policy of explaining away the phenomenon at all costs. Later, the purpose was said to be the ultimate eradication of the UFO problem by gradually playing down its significance. And this may make sense, for if UFOs were seen not to be a defense threat, then why should the U.S. Air Force worry about them, whatever they were? But even so, this behavior fanned the fires of suspicion. Donald Kehoe, a retired Marine Corps major, was the principal motivator of public belief in the cover-up. He cited instances such as the death of Captain Thomas Mantell, killed in his aircraft while climbing to chase a UFO above Godman Air Force Field in Kentucky. It seemed that Mitchell was in pursuit of a secret U.S. Navy weather balloon that had stayed into the area, but nobody told the Air Force about this until the balloon was declassified years later. Desperate for any answer, to squash the idea Mantell had been shot down by an alien death ray, the U.S. Air Force claimed that Mantell had been chasing Venus, an explanation so inadequate that Kehoe had no difficulty in persuading the press that the Air Force was covering up the truth. Kehoe launched his attack on the U.S. Air Force's official UFO policy in the January 1950 issue of True magazine, with a story that rapidly became a sensation and stimulated a string of books, one of which was turned into a classic science fiction movie, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers. In 1957, he formed the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, to continue the fight against what he considered to be an obvious cover-up by the Air Force. But if there was a cover-up, it was probably at a much higher level. Project Blue Book, the last U.S. Air Force project after Grudge, may have also been ignorant of the truth. The first chief of Project Blue Book was intelligence officer Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. He was the only Air Force officer who openly admitted that he took UFOs very seriously. In his brief time at the helm, he adopted new techniques and appointed proper scientific staff, including Dr. J. Allen Hynek as chief scientific advisor. He proposed cost-effective scientific experiments intended to discover the truth once and for all, and often paid his own expenses to investigate interesting cases, and most of them were very interesting. Those he studied during 1952 and 1953 were frankly astonishing. In 1956, he published a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which is packed with tales of radar contacts, military jet chases, movie films of UFOs, and so on. It is hard to read the text and not conclude that UFOs are real, solid phenomena. This was a very strange state of affairs. In 1953, the official U.S. Air Force line was still that UFOs were not of interest. But here was Ruppelt, the head of their own study group, publishing a book that not only stated otherwise, but emphasized their significance. Given what occurred after the Project Sign report, it is hardly surprising to learn that Ruppelt left the Air Force in 1953, very disillusioned at the official line on UFOs that his superiors expected him to convey to the public. In fact, he modified some of his more extreme statements in later editions of his book, possibly under official pressure. He died in 1960. Until it was closed down in 1969, Project Blue Book continued to explain away the UFO phenomenon. The turning point in UFO history may well have come in January 1953, when the CIA ordered the conveying of the Robertson Panel, an elite team of scientists who were to carry out yet another secret study of UFOs. They spent a mere 4 days looking at the best available evidence and gave their report on the basis of CIA fears that a hostile country might use UFO panics as cover for an invasion. Some of the panel's recommendations, declassified much later, included surveillance of civilian UFO groups to watch for enemy infiltration, enlisting psychologists, and perhaps even cartoonists to make UFOs appear ludicrous, and a wholesale, cold-blooded debunking of cases. The U.S. Air Force complied with some of these ideas enthusiastically, and later in 1953 it was even made an offense under the Espionage Act to release official UFO reports. This clampdown did not apply only to military personnel, but also to anyone who knew about the anti-UFO propaganda campaign. We can only guess at what effect the Robertson Panel had on serious UFO research, for although the CIA continued to deny that they had ever been interested in UFOs, we now know that they were extremely interested in them even before 1953. The decade that followed this epic meeting of the Robertson Panel saw the rise of independent UFO research groups, most of which firmly believed that the U.S. Air Force were deliberately withholding the truth. But the staff of Blue Book seem, in retrospect, to have been merely pawns. Several times they made efforts to pass on their UFO files to a more scientific body, such as NASA, having recognized that UFOs were not a defense threat, but, if anything, worthy of proper scientific investigation. However, ironically, their own debunking methods had been so successful that no scientific group would associate itself with UFOs, leaving Blue Book with a phenomenon that they had no inclination to deal with and no facilities to handle. With a new wave of UFO sightings in 1965, the U.S. Air Force seized upon a suggestion by J. Allen Hynek that a scientific panel be conveyed to study the phenomenon. The panel first met in February of 1966 under the directorship of Dr. Brian O'Brien. Unfortunate name. The O'Brien Commission did not find any evidence of a defense threat, but did recommend that selected universities examine 100 UFO cases each year, devoting 10 working days to each case. Each team, it was suggested, should include a psychologist, a physical scientist, and an astronomer. They also urged,
Urge. I've got the urge.
They also urged Blue Book to make its files available to Congress and other public persons to remove all suspicion of a cover-up. In 2 months, Congressman Gerald Ford, later U.S. President, succeeded in establishing open Congress hearings at which the O'Brien recommendations were publicly urged. Onto the Air Force. This time, there was no fight. They were adopted, all but for the release of the files. This led to one of the strangest and saddest tales in the history of UFO study, that of the scientific study of unidentified flying objects undertaken by Colorado University for the U.S. Air Force Office of Aerospace Research. The famous physicist, Dr. Edward U. Condon, was asked to lead its 2-year study. How those years and the $500,000 grant were spent created an underlying controversy. From the outset, Condon and his chief administrator, Robert J. Lowe, openly declared their disbelief in UFOs. When Lowe was asked to visit European ufologists during a scheduled visit to attend a conference, he refused to do so and went to Loch Ness instead. As he put it, neither UFOs nor the monster existed, but it was interesting to compare the two phenomena. The negative findings of the 1,000-page Condon report published in 1969 gave the U.S. Air Force the opportunity to wash their hands of the whole UFO business, in public at least. Fortunately, most readers of the report realized that Condon's negative conclusions simply did not tie in with the fact that 1/3 of the cases his team investigated defied explanation. The report had some indirect results. Several scientists became interested in the UFO phenomenon, and Dr. Hynek, free of his Air Force commitments, went on to form the first science-based UFO group, the Center for UFO Studies, in 1973. Pressure on the U.S. Air Force to make their files public continued. Members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, including Carl Sagan, Thornton Page, and other scientists who were not convinced of the reality of UFOs, signed a petition requesting that the files be made open to scientists. Despite the impressive list of signatures, it was turned down. Only when the new Freedom of Information Act became law in 1976 did the U.S. Air Force finally give way. Certainly these files reveal the incompetence of the U.S. Air Force work. The standards of investigation of many civilian UFO groups were much higher, but the U.S. Air Force's brief was only to investigate the threat and defense posed by UFOs, not to inquire into their essential nature. The release of previously classified information also brought to light many documents whose existence had previously been denied. This fact, plus lever of the new act, led to a decision by some ufologists to find out what else had gone on undercover. What part had the CIA and other state security agencies played? As for the Condon report files, they never were released. Dr. Condon went to his grave insisting that UFOs were bunk, and calling all those who believed in them kooks. He burnt all the records. That's pretty bunk. The British Ministry of Defence has been collecting UFO reports since the 1960s and continues to do so. Its Whitehall offices house files that would, if ever released, prove extremely interesting to ufologists. The number of UFO reports for 1981 alone, as quoted in the House of Lords UFO debate in March of 1982, showed that the military defense collected over 5 times as many cases during that year as Britain's leading civilian UFO society, the British UFO Research Association. The military of defense says that UFO reports are the province of one small department that has, in fact, principal responsibility for low-flying aircraft. Jenny Randles has engaged in a lengthy battle with the department concerned, suggesting that it would be in everyone's best interest for it to release the UFO files to a scientific establishment, since the military of defense has repeatedly claimed that whatever UFOs are, they represent no threat to national security. But she has been refused access to the files on the basis that they contain classified information. When, in 1983, she asked the military of defense for an official statement regarding its policy on UFOs, she received the following: "The sole interest of the Ministry of Defense in UFO reports is to establish whether they reveal anything to defense interest. There is no unit within the ministry appointed solely for the study of UFOs, and no staff are employed upon the subject on a full-time basis. The Ministry of Defense does not deny that there are strange things to see in the sky. It believes, however, that there are adequate material explanations for these. It certainly has no evidence that alien spacecraft have landed on this planet." In response to demands for publication of UFO reports, Viscount Long of the military defense said that he saw no objection to these reports being made public. "We are therefore studying the best means of publishing this material." On the surface, this seems a reasonable enough attitude, but still UFOs are not treated as a scientific issue by British government institutions. A decision to release the British files was taken during 1982, but was severely delayed by the Falklands War. The decision was a direct result of a long battle waged by Lord Clancarty and his House of Lords all-party UFO study group, who finally forced the 1982 debate on the subject. The study group included former Admiral of the Fleet Lord Hill Norton, who, even while holding a top-level position in the military defense, knew nothing of the sheer scale of the UFO problem. He later believed that he was deliberately kept in ignorance of a cover-up campaign, but on whose orders? And if someone at his level was not considered fit to be told of a cover-up, then who was? When the U.S. government finally opened its top-secret files to the public, it was obvious that there had been a deliberate cover-up. Other governments had apparently covered up too. But why? Jeannie Randalls assesses the implications of such a policy. Thanks, Jeannie. One might think that the story of official UFO investigation in the United States ended with the release of the Blue Book files in 1977. In fact, in one sense, it had only begun at this point, for it became evident that the CIA had played a dominant part in the UFO business, and not only, as many first suspected, by changing the United States Air Force's UFO policy through manipulating the Robertson panel. In an attempt to find out what other clandestine organizations had taken place, a civilian group, Ground Saucer Watch, and then later a specially formed action campaign called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, set up lawsuits to dole out classified information from the various intelligence agencies. Using the new Freedom of Information Act as a lever, they succeeded after a fight in obtaining some reports. Although fragmentary, they reveal evidence of military involvement previously unknown. There was much that postdated the closure of Project Blue Book, which had allegedly ended the U.S. government's interest in UFOs. Dr. J. Allen Hynek said in summarizing these documents, "In case after case in these military dispatches, the reliability and technical competence of the witness is attested to. In case after case, the UFO remains a UFO that is completely unidentified. Among the papers are radar visual cases, jet plane chases, and a very disturbing wave of sightings between October 27th to November 10th, 1975, when low-level aerial objects that were not identified repeatedly buzzed sensitive missile launch facilities and military weapon stores. There is also mention of the classic 1976 radar visual report when an Iranian jet had apparently been inspected by a probe from a UFO. These accounts were often of such great interest as the circulation lists appended showed. Copies were sent to the U.S. Secretary of State, the Pentagon, the White House, and several security agencies. Under the direction of lawyer Peter Geston and several American UFO experts, the legal battle has continued. The existence of hundreds of pertinent documents has been admitted by the authorities, but most of them have not been released. A lawsuit against the National Security Agency for the release of 131 admitted UFO documents reached the Supreme Court of Appeals in 1982 after being rejected at all other levels. The following official statement illustrates the reason given for non-release of this material. Public interest in the disclosure is far outweighed by the sensitive nature of the materials and the obvious effect on national security their release may well entail. Certain skeptics suggest that this simply implies that UFO investigations may also turn up top-secret defense data, but surely such information could be censored. Yet, it remains highly probable that not even satisfied versions of these papers will be accessible. Even the ruling judges in these cases have been officially cleared, only to see lengthy affidavits explaining why the documents must not be released. Just what is it about the UFOs that causes documents concerning them to be such a sensitive nature? It is hardly surprising that some ufologists in the United States are more convinced than ever that their government has not told all it knows. And so the battle in the courts goes on, despite a desperate shortage of funds. The American UFO scene being so confused, it is almost inevitable that the situation in Europe is a similar state. Many European nations rely on the USA for defense aid, so it seems logical to direct a question of unidentified aerial objects in Europe at the U.S. military. It is possible, for example, that countries such as Britain have looked to the USA for lead about UFOs, and noting the inconclusive nature of the U.S. Air Force research projects and the negative Condon report, concluded that UFOs represent no defense threat, in which case further research would be a waste of time. Then again, if secret, high-level investigation has been conducted into the UFO phenomenon, for whatever reason, the whole of NATO might conceivably have been made aware of this fact and perhaps its conclusions. In Britain, the Ministry of Defense says UFOs are not of defense interest. It also says that it is the only aspect of the problem that is of interest. Yet it continues to collect UFO reports, and when asked to hand over the information to a scientific institute, it refuses to do so, using, as in the United States, the excuse that national security might be compromised. While this could, of course, be a wholly reasonable proposition, could very easily be misconstrued as an attempt to hide unpalatable facts. Other European governments have, in the past, behaved rather like that of Britain, but have gradually modified their approach to UFOs. Spain is typical of this new liberal attitude. In October of 1976, the journalist and UFO investigator Juan Jose Benitez was rather astonished to be offered access to some government documents concerning UFOs. A whole batch of reports was cleared for him, and others followed. These turned out to be detailed accounts of sightings of puzzling aerial phenomena, nearly always involving military personnel. Reports containing accounts of radar trackings and military jet scramblings formed the basis of the documents that were released later. Benitez has released the contents of several of these files in Flying Saucer Review, and there seems to be every indication that this new open approach will continue. In November of 1980, for example, the Spanish Minister of Transport said that in his view there was now no doubt that UFOs are real. This followed an incident in 1974 in which a UFO tracked on radar made a close approach to a civil airliner, causing it to make a forced landing. In June of 1976, General Carlos Caballero was quoted as saying, "I have for some time held the view that UFOs are extraterrestrial craft." He added that many countries were collaborating on research and that the world would soon be told the truth. We're still waiting. But the first European nation to respond with a new initiative to the UFO phenomenon was France. Indeed, the French stance on the subject remains unique throughout the world. Yet only the British Military of Defense told this author some time ago that its position did not differ significantly from that of France. Between January 28th and March 22nd, 1974, the radio station France Inter ran a nightly series of interviews with various world experts on UFOs. This included a most significant session with the then French Minister of Defense, M. Robert Galli. He talked freely about UFOs, saying, "I will indeed go so far as to say that it is irrefutable that there are things today that are inexplicable or poorly explained. I must say that if your listeners could see for themselves for the massive reports that are coming in from the mobile gendarmerie and from the gendarmerie charged with the job of conducting investigations, then they would see it all pretty disturbing." Such a categorical statement is undeniably of the greatest importance. France is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. If its defense minister makes comments such as these, then presumably they ought to be treated very seriously. Perhaps significantly, no British newspaper made any comment about this remarkable disclosure. The police had indeed handled the official investigation of UFO reports in France. In 1970, they began to pass them to Dr. Claude Power at the Space Center in Toulouse. Power, a leading UFO investigator, worked on these in a private capacity and often reported his findings in Flying Saucer Review. Not long after Galli's speech, the French government gave Power a grant to head a new team of scientists based at the Space Center, the Groupe d'études des phénomènes aérospatiaux non identifiés, also known as GPAN. I think I'll call it that. The group for the study of unidentified aerial phenomena. On the basis of its early results, funds were increased. It was the only known government-backed UFO research team in the world, and it seems that, to the French government at least, the output was well worth the investment. GPAN published several reports in its first 3 years, but these stopped after about 1981. A key member of the GPAN team was astrophysicist Dr. Pierre Guérin. In 1979, summarized its latest position in a lengthy paper published in the Flying Saucer Review. Giroux's article can be described only as astonishing, for he thoroughly and logically eliminated all the stock explanation of UFOs, and particularly those in vogue, such as their psychic origin, including emphatically, an intelligence controls the UFOs, and is not ours. According to Guérin, this unknown intelligence deliberately sets out to make scientists doubt its existence and also to persuade us that we are masters of the world, when the chilling truth is that we are not. It is, as he put it when discussing the intelligence's motives. The ox will never know that he will be chopped into beefsteaks. However, Guérin did not think that we were destined for some larder in the sky. On the contrary, he believes this intelligence has continually guided our progress. This was a member of a full-time official UFO project speaking, and he added that, in our opinion, they, the governments of the world, do know the truth about the reality of UFOs, but have no idea of how to go about tackling the problem. But Guérin made no more public statements, and Claude Power left GPAN to sail around the world in a homemade boat. He has not been heard from since. The next head of GPAN, Dr. Alan Misterl, remained much more tight-lipped than his predecessors, although he continued to receive support from civilian UFO societies. In the circumstances, some people see this sudden change of attitude of the official French team as highly suspicious, and it is alleged, on good authority, that the French president, Georges Pompidou, on his deathbed said to his good friend, the defense minister Galli, "Don't you think we have enough muck on our hands without bringing in the saucers?" Some might read into such a statement Pompidou's belief in the existence of UFOs and their nuance value. In late 1982, a number of French UFO groups began to express their frustration at the sudden about-face of Japan's attitudes, but then the French government suddenly removed its financial backing. The group was disbanded. As UFOs continue to be reported all over the world, governments can no longer deny that such things exist. But as Jenny Randles shows, official attitudes tend to be alarmingly inconsistent. Thanks, Jenny. The governments of the world seem, despite their protestations to the contrary, to take the subject of UFOs very seriously. The U.S. government certainly does, and refuses to release key documents because it claims they would compromise national security. Britain maintains a stiff upper lip on the subject, but all the evidence points to an active interest in UFOs at a high level. Several European nations admit openly to the reality of UFOs. A leading scientist working with Japan, France's former government-funded UFO research project, went further and proclaimed that the phenomenon is produced by an intelligence that is actually the dominant form of life on this planet. Such widespread interest seems inconsistent with the commonly held opinion that ufology is, at best, a pseudoscience, and should stay that way. Several of the smaller nations, such as those in South America, have issued bold statements concerning the reality and nature of UFOs. The media coverage of UFO reports in these countries is fairly extensive and rarely critical, so it is hardly surprising that they should offer their view that UFOs are representatives of a higher intelligence. In 1978, the then president of Grenada, Sir Eric Gary, tried to force a United Nations debate on UFOs. He succeeded. Many impressive depositions were made, including contributions by Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Dr. Jacques Vallée, but nothing beyond a resolution calling for further action emerged, and Sir Eric was unable to push for the resolution to be implemented. The situation in the Soviet Union is characteristically complicated and obscured by officialdom. We know that parapsychology has always been treated with respect in the USSR, but very little was known about the official Soviet attitude to UFOs until 1967, when Dr. Jacques Vallée paid a visit there. As it happened, his trip coincided with the foundation of a scientific UFO research group, whose head was Dr. Felix Zeigel, a professor of cosmetology at Moscow's Institute of Aviation, and the man responsible, under government direction, for the training of cosmonauts. Working with him in UFO research was an Air Force major called Zolia Rove. They claimed that the authorities promised them, when their group was properly established, that they would be given the 1,500 UFO reports in their possession. However, this promise was never kept. The group eventually being told, "You are too small, and the UFO problem is too big." Starrov and Zeigel were, however, given permission to appear on national television, which they did on November 10, 1967, telling the Soviet citizens UFOs are a very serious subject, which we must study fully. They also launched an appeal for UFO reports. Shortly after this, however, Zeigel suddenly adopted a low profile when U.S. journalists Sheila Alstander and Lynn Schroeder visited the USSR in the late 1960s to collect material for their psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain. The only scientist concerned they were not allowed to meet was Felix Zeigel. On June 14, 1980, at 11:50 p.m., an orange horseshoe-shaped UFO appeared in the sky to the northwest of Moscow. It was seen by thousands of people. The giant object actually cruised over the streets of the capital, causing a great panic. Some people fled into fallout shelters, believing that the Third World War had begun. But the object moved away without harming anyone. And the next day, the Soviet media made no mention of this event. However, somewhat oddly, in view of his strange reticence on the subject of UFOs, Zeigel suddenly spoke of craft detaching themselves from the horseshoe-shaped mothership and disgorging aliens onto the streets of Moscow. Yet Zeigel must have known that the UFO was very probably the satellite Cosmos 1188 shortly after its launch from a site at Plensk, just north of Moscow. Western scientists were well aware of this, and although ordinary Soviet citizens are generally kept in the dark about their own government's activities, Zeigel, as a trainer of cosmonauts, must have known about it. His extraordinary claims may, in fact, be proof that he had been finally let into the secrets contained in the 1,500 official UFO reports, on condition, presumably, that he became a pawn of the Soviet government. And this may have involved using unlikely UFO stories to act as a cover for some kind of secret government activities. Although Zeigel has published many articles about UFOs in the USSR, he seems to be very reluctant to share his data with ufologists elsewhere. Perhaps it is simply too problematic to smuggle information out of the country, but others have managed to do so, albeit with some difficulty. Nikita Shiny is one Soviet ufologist who regularly sends UFO reports to the West. Commenting on Zeigel's cases, he says, "We checked them out, and not a single one was found to be true." Shiny works at a scientific research establishment and, together with fellow scientist Vladimir Zaha, attempted to set up a private UFO research institute between 1978 and 1979. But they were continually blocked by a Communist Party who, announcing that study of UFOs was anti-state, broke up their meetings. Zeigel is alleged to have telephoned Shiny and said, "Well, they dispersed you, huh? I fixed that for you." Dri Lana is another Soviet ufologist who has sent UFO reports to the West that mirror characteristics of typical cases elsewhere, including close encounters. However, Lana has suffered too. He claims he was persecuted because of his activities and eventually managed to escape by entering into an arranged marriage with a Finnish ufologist. Although he now lives in Finland, Lana returns to the USSR to lecture about UFOs, and he says the KGB still watches him closely. The only realistic conclusion about ufology in the USSR is that it is seen as dangerous, and therefore must be of great interest to the government. The Australian authorities, on the other hand, seem only too eager to give researchers unlimited access to their UFO files. In late 1981, ufologist Bill Chalker was suddenly given the opportunity to see the UFO reports then in the possession of the Royal Australian Air Force. During 1982, Chalker took up the offer with enthusiasm. He was even allowed to copy whatever he wanted, although presumably enough, was required to sign a waiver to guarantee the confidentiality of the witnesses involved. No other restrictions were imposed upon him. The cases reported in the RAAF files apparently gave rise to the official pronouncement, "Nothing that has arisen from the 3 or 4% of unexplained cases gives any firm support for the belief that interlopers from other planets in the world or outside of it have been visiting us." However, according to Bill Chalker, many of the cases are extremely provocative. Typical of these is a series of amazing events that took place around Brisbane Airport on November 4th, 1976. Ground staff saw a pulsing light in the sky, and the crew of an Electra transport aircraft observed the same object keeping pace with them before moving off southward at 1.5 times their speed. A commercial jet was also paced, and a nearby light aircraft reported a close encounter. Both local weather radar and the airport radar tracked an unidentified object that seemed to match the sightings. The conclusion of the report in the RAAF files is that the light was probably the planet Venus. Yeah. And the radar returns ships at sea. Although the pilots all refused the suggestion that they had been paced by a planet, and the highly experienced radar operators said that they had never before picked up echoes from ships the RAAF had pursued the usual official line of inquiry, based entirely on concern over a possible threat to national defense. No scientific study was undertaken. Significantly, the files contain memoranda that suggested some RAAF personnel were aware that a cover-up would be suspected. One of them says, "We only foster the incorrect, but nevertheless widely held belief that we have much vital information to hide." Bill Chalker concludes that the openness of the assistance he was offered and the contents of the files themselves militate against the idea of an official cover-up. In fact, the files indicate that the RAAF was as puzzled as anyone else about the UFO phenomenon. And there are many cases, Chalker points out, that do not appear in the RAAF files, some of which, at the very least, highly provocative. In 1981, Australia passed its own Freedom of Information Act, the consequences of which opened the official files to Bill Chalker. But perhaps such apparent openness is merely an attempt to discourage ufologists to investigate further. If one looks at the official changes of the attitude to UFOs since the 1970s, a clear pattern seems to emerge. Spain released its files to interested parties in 1976. The Blue Book documents were made accessible to the U.S. public in 1977. France set up an official UFO study group, which made some interesting statements in the late 70s. And in 1981, Australia opened its files. In 1982, Britain announced that its UFO files would be made public. In every case, the country concerned has maintained for years that UFOs do not exist, or that no such files have been kept. All of this may, of course, simply be a coincidence, and perhaps such movies as Close Encounters of the Third Kind have created such a sense of unease in the public mind that governments have felt compelled to reassure people that there is, in fact, no sinister cover-up, and so have released their files for public scrutiny. That may not be the whole story, however. The fact that governments all over the world have kept records of UFO cases, and some of them spent vast sums of money on official studies of them, attests to the mystery surrounding the phenomenon. And the fact that no government has claimed to solve the enigma must be significant. One apparently extraterrestrial explanation of the official attitude to UFOs has been put forward by the Earl of Clancarty, otherwise known as the UFO writer Brinsley Lepore Trench, who believes that there is indeed been in the world wide UFO cover-up, but that is gradually being replaced by a subtle UFO education program of which few people are aware. Lord Clancarty asserts that we are being conditioned to accept the truth. Perhaps even enormously popular movies such as E.T. the Extraterrestrial, where the alien is presented as extremely lovable, are part of this education campaign. Nobody will fear UFOs anymore. But if this is true, what are we being prepared for? Lord Clancarty, together with an increasing number of other ufologists, suspects that UFOs represent the real rulers of this planet, and such a revelation could not be sprung on the world without the most appalling panic. Hence the need for the re-education program. If this is the real reason for the curiously inconsistent behavior of the world governments over the UFO issues, then they have an unenviable task ahead of them to ensure that the millions of people on Earth of widely different cultures are prepared to receive the greatest news story ever. Yet the world has a right to know the truth about UFOs, be it disappointingly mundane or as astoundingly significant as Lord Clancarty's theory suggests. The evidence seems to point to a move toward discovering the truth. Are the days of the cover-up nearly over? I don't think so. Have UFOs crashed on Earth? Ever since the term flying saucer was coined in 1947, there have been rumors that the U.S. government has one or more crashed UFOs, complete with alien pilots, in its custody. Hilary Evans presents the evidence behind this extraordinary idea. Thanks, Hilary. Almost as soon as the first flying saucers were reported in 1947, rumors began circulating that one of them had crashed and was under examination by American scientists. It was logical enough, given the great number that seemed to be around. It seemed statistically certain that sooner or later one of them would suffer an accident or breakdown, or be shot down by some earthly power. Such reasoning assumed that the UFOs were solid, material objects, liable to physical accident and mechanical malfunction. In those early days, there was little question in anyone's mind that the UFOs were as solid as terrestrial aircraft. The only question was, where did they originate? What threw the crash saucer legend into dispute was, paradoxically, a book that set out to establish it as fact. In 1950, an American writer named Frank Scully brought out Behind the Flying Saucers, which became a sensational bestseller in both the USA and Europe. Something of the contemporary climate of opinion comes over the dust cover blurb. It is typical of the whole extraordinary and delightful business of the flying saucers that the first person to attempt a serious book about them should be the show business magazine Variety's ace columnist. The point could have been made even more strongly by mentioning that Scully was also the author of Fun in Bed, a collection of diversions for the bedridden, which was sufficiently successful to be followed by More Fun in Bed and Junior Fun in Bed. True, there were few serious ufologists around in 1950, but Scully's credentials did nothing to enhance the credibility of his story. The story Scully had to tell needed all the support it could get. In the course of his professional writing, he claimed he had come across a Texas oil man named Silas Newton, who in turn told Scully of his catalog Dr. G, who he alleged had first-hand knowledge of 3 UFOs that were held in the custody of the United States military, along with 16 dead occupants, about 3 feet tall. No supported evidence was produced. All depended on the word of Dr. G, who claimed to have been one of the scientists called in by the authorities to examine the UFOs. This drawback did not prevent Scully's book selling more than 60,000 copies, but it did mean that when 2 years later, a journalist named J.P. Kahn wrote an article pointing out the weaknesses of Scully's story, he found it easy enough to persuade the world that it was a total fabrication. The fact that Kahn's expose was itself full of exaggerations and inaccuracies was overlooked. It made its point, which was that Scully had taken a story on trust and done virtually no independent research. Newton and Dr. G were labeled frauds. The disrepute into which the crash and capture story subsequently fell was not, of course, entirely due to Scully's shortcomings. Quite independently, public opinion was swinging around the idea that UFOs, whatever else they might be, were not man-made, and if they were the products of an extraterrestrial technology, the technology that had brought them to Earth might also save them from the breakdowns and accidents to which earthly machines are liable. It was not until some 25 years later that the crashed saucer legend surfaced again. In April of 1976, there appeared in the pages of Official UFO, at that time a fairly serious journal, an article titled, "What About Crashed UFOs?" by the widely respected investigator Raymond Fowler. Instead of serving up the vague rumors of the past, he produced dramatic new evidence in the form of a technician's sworn statement that he had personally examined a crashed UFO at Kingman, Arizona on May 21st, 1953. From then on, interest in the subject became both more serious and more intense. Another investigator of repute, Leonard Stringfield, dedicated himself to the search for further evidence, and while he ranged far and wide for his quest, William Moore and Stanton Friedman in conjunction with Charles Berlitz, concentrated on a single case that was to become very famous, the Roswell incident. The story in outline is as follows. Sitting outside their home on the night of July 2nd, 1947, a couple in Roswell, New Mexico, saw a glowing object streak across the sky. About 75 miles further on the direction of his path, a rancher next morning found extraordinary debris scattered over his ground. A further 150 miles or so away, an engineer and some archaeologists came across the remains of an unidentified flying vehicle, together with several very strange bodies. The authorities took control, announced that the object was simply a weather balloon, and nothing more was heard of the matter until Moore, Friedman, and Berlitz took it up. Other cases, uncannily similar in some respects, abound. On July 7, 1948, near Del Rio, Texas, unusual radar sightings led to the suspicion that an unidentified flying object had crashed some 30 miles across the Mexican border. With permission from the Mexican government, U.S. troops went to investigate and found a metallic disc with the burned bodies of the crew, more or less human-like beings, about 5 feet tall. The object, which had been clocked at 2,000 miles per hour by radar, had been simultaneously seen on radar by U.S. Air Force Colonel Whitcomb in an F-94. He landed at his home base and immediately took off for the scene in a borrowed light aircraft. He found Mexican troops in control and the object hidden from sight. A naval intelligence officer arrived in time to see the crash area roped off and some object being loaded onto trucks. The troops taking part were apparently warned that if they spoke of the matter, they would be the sorriest people around. Some photographs, allegedly, of the bodies of the occupants were circulating clandestinely some years later. They continued to be the subject of controversial debate. Sometime in 1952, at the Muroc Air Force Base in California, the U.S. Air Force radar operator tracked an object descending toward Earth at great speed. After a crash had been confirmed, he was instructed, "You didn't see anything." Later he learned that a UFO, more than 17 yards in diameter, had crashed in a desert area not far away. It was metallic and badly burned. It contained bodies of beings about 5 feet tall. The debris was kept for a while at the base and then allegedly shipped to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. There is strong evidence that at this time some object was indeed secretly shipped to the Wright-Patterson Base. Possibly relating to the same incident is a film that was shown the following spring, apparently by the military authorities, to a select group, including a radar specialist, a Mr. T.E., who was working with the Army and Air Force stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and who had secret security clearance. The 5-minute movie showed a silver dish-shaped object embedded in the sand in a remote desert area. It had a dome on top and an open hatch or door. Some 10 or 15 military personnel could be seen standing near the craft and its diameter. Based on a comparison of the size with that of a human figure, appeared to be 6 to 8 yards. The film also showed bodies of 3 dead occupants. They were small and human-like, with overlarge heads. The viewers were told to think about the film, but not tell anyone about it. 2 weeks later, they were told it was a hoax. It seems strange, for there is a certain amount of evidence that the film was shown to officers at a number of military bases. Clearly, someone somewhere felt that it was important for them to see it. It seems all the more unlikely because, quite apart from the poor quality of the film, which paradoxically tends to suggest it is genuine, the cost in time and effort of setting up so elaborate a fake would have been formidable. The most explicit item of evidence in the entire crashed UFO saga is an affidavit signed in 1973 by a certain Fritz Werner, a pseudonym, although his true identity is known, who swore that he had assisted at the investigation into a crashed unknown object. While serving as project engineer on an Air Force contract near Kingman, Arizona in 1953, he was given an assignment, Along with some 15 others, he was taken early one morning under strict security conditions in a blacked-out bus on a 5-hour journey. He and his companions were told that a super-secret Air Force craft had crashed, and that each of them was to investigate the crash in terms of his specific field of expertise. Warner described the object as 2 deep saucers, one inverted on the other, about 11 yards in diameter, made of dull silver metal, with an open hatch to the interior. His particular task was to calculate the object's impact velocity from the traces. He found no landing gear, also no dents or scratches. In a tent nearby, he saw a dead humanoid on a table, about 4 feet 3 inches tall. Not only were the investigators instructed to tell nobody of the incident, they were not even allowed to discuss it among themselves. Another incident from 1953 that may confirm the Fritz Warner report is the case of a metallurgist named Daly, who worked for the Air Force at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. He described being taken to a location unidentified, abounding in hot sand. For the last part of his journey, he was blindfolded. For 2 days he was required to examine the structure of a silvery metallic craft lying undamaged in the sand. He concluded that it was not of earthly origin. He saw no sign of occupants. Despite the evident discrepancies, those 2 reports may relate to the same incident. Relevant, too, may be the evidence given by the wife of a guard at Wright-Patterson. She alleged that, at about this time, her husband witnessed scientists examining the bodies of large-headed humanoids about 3 feet in height. Another incident, 2 years later, at Wright-Patterson Base, may confirm that pilots of crashed spacecraft were taken there for examination. A woman whose duty was to catalog all incoming material relating to UFOs stated that she saw the bodies of 2 dead humanoids, about 5 feet tall, with large heads, being transferred from one location to another. In March of 1964, it was reported that a round, flat UFO, giving off a bright blue and orange light, had crashed high on Mount Chitpec, Mexico. Officials wanted to take it to the nearest town, San Cristobal de las Casas, but the local tribe, the Caluas, insisted it was a gift from God and the Virgin, and refused to allow its removal. In Tarija, in the most remote and inaccessible part of Bolivia, many people saw a glowing object cross the afternoon sky on May 6, 1978. It was generally described as a metallic cylinder, some 8 or 9 yards in length, and artificial, though without windows or structural details. It was closely followed by another, smaller object. A few seconds later, there was the sound of a great explosion, accompanied by an earthquake, that was registered on seismic equipment over some 77,000 square miles. After the crash, the smaller object was seen to fly away. The object's rate of travel was far too slow for it to have been a meteor, and investigation ruled out a satellite returning to Earth. But while speculation bubbled in the press, a security blackout was officially imposed. Reporters saw the object removed by technicians and asserted that it had been taken by the United States Air Force back to the USA. NASA denied being involved, as it would, of course, have done even if it had been. The foregoing cases have been presented with a minimal of comment. They have been put together from accounts that often contain contradictory statements. They represent, however, the most coherent version available. At the same time, they represent less than half the alleged incidents. The evidence is very far from being convincing. At the same time, it is very hard to discount it altogether. To assert that every one of these allegations is a lie or misinterpretation of some simple event is to call in question a great number of witnesses, unknown to one another, yet many of them wholeheartedly trusted by experienced investigators. Their accounts, while often hazy and contradictory, nevertheless all point in the same direction. Fragmentary evidence. In June of 1952, 6 Norwegian Army jets on summer maneuvers over the bleakly inhospitable islands of Spitsbergen spotted wreckage in a mountain area near the Henopin Straits. Within hours, using ski planes, Norwegian investigators were on the site, including an expert on rocketry. No doubt a Soviet vehicle or missile was suspected, but instead they found the wreckage of a disc-shaped object with 46 jet-like orifices on the rim, and the object seemed to be made of an unknown metal. There was no trace of occupants. But what is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this incident is the comment of a high-ranking Army officer, Colonel Gunnar Darnable of the Norwegian General Staff, who in 1955 said, "The crashing of the Spitsbergen disk was highly important. Although our present scientific knowledge does not permit us to solve all the riddles, I am confident when Spitsbergen will be of utmost importance." Some time ago, a misunderstanding was caused by saying that this disk probably was of Soviet origin. We wish to state categorically that it was not built by any country on Earth. The materials used in its construction are completely unknown to the experts who took part in the investigation. He added that American and British experts were being consulted. Since then, nothing. Picking up the pieces. To most ordinary people, the idea that the U.S. government holds secret details of crashed UFOs sounds like paranoid nonsense. Here, Hillary Evans shows there is a disturbing amount of evidence that something is being officially covered up. But what? Thanks, Hillary. Somewhere in the U.S. there is a locked warehouse guarded as no other place has ever been, accessible only to men of the highest security clearance possible in the government and the Pentagon. Because in that warehouse stronghold lies irrefutable evidence that UFOs exist. So, in 1974, American ufologist Otto Binder, author of one of the most objective books on the subject, What We Really Know About Flying Saucers, expressed the belief that the U.S. government has captured and holds a spacecraft from beyond this Earth. It is a belief that is for many an article of faith, but for many others no more than a deliciously spine-tingling myth. While there is undoubtedly insufficient substance to the story to justify the former in their total commitment, there is quite enough to make even the most skeptical pause to ask whether, just possibly, there might be a little bit of fire at the source of so much smoke. In a field of inquiry in which, as we have seen, the evidence is so sparse, so contradictory, and so lacking in support, and often emanating from anonymous witnesses or nothing more than hearsay, it is tempting to dismiss the crash and capture myth as either the connotation of sensationalist journalists or the projection of individual paranoia. For many years, alternating between these hypotheses, serious ufology managed to avoid challenging the myth. But things changed when, among other things, the Watergate affair and revelations about the war in Southeast Asia showed just how secretive the U.S. government was capable of being, how deceivously it could act, how far it was prepared to lie to the American public. For years, it had been claimed that the CIA had not the slightest interest in UFOs, but the Freedom of Information Act, which became law in 1976, enabled investigators to obtain documentary proof that, on the contrary, the CIA had long taken a very serious interest. This information was obtained from the tiny portion of official documentation that the U.S. government had been forced to disclose. There still remains an incalculable quantity that it is able to withhold from the public on grounds of national security. What secrets may be contained in it can only be guessed at, but sufficient has been learned to justify ufologists in taking a closer, harder look at some of the more extreme claims. By the 1970s, a new generation of ufologists had appeared on the scene, men and women who were no longer willing to accept reports at their face value, whether it was a question of witness testimony on the one hand or official explanations on the other. For this, much of the credit must go to veteran ufologist Leonard Stringfield, who has almost single-handedly put together evidence that the American government has UFOs and UFO entities in its possession. The result of his efforts is a dossier of testimony that, while largely emanating from individuals who prefer to remain anonymous, nevertheless is coherent and consistent to an impressive degree. Meanwhile, operating on a narrow front but in greater depth, William Moore and Stratton Friedman, along with Charles Berlitz, covered the intricacies of the Roswell incident, which established beyond any reasonable doubt that an unidentified object, not necessarily of alien origin, got into trouble over New Mexico in 1947, and that the U.S. government was both very concerned about the incident and extremely embarrassed by it. There is strong, consistent, and clear-cut evidence that an exceptionally large load, the wreckage of the crashed object perhaps, was carried across country by the military at the time, under conditions of maximum security. A series of reports have been brought to light, each of them trivial in itself, but adding up to a convincing picture. The destination of some of the material was widely alleged to be Muroc Air Force Base in California, and this was the location for one of the most incredible, yet at the same time, one of the most enduring components of the myth. It is claimed that on February 20th, 1954, the President of the United States, General Eisenhower, went to Muroc to see the saucers for himself. In principle, it is perfectly possible. Eisenhower was at the time enjoying a golfing vacation on a friend's ranch at Palm Springs, only 90 miles away from Muroc. Yet only a week previously, he had returned from a quail shooting holiday in Georgia. Would even the most sporting president, it has been asked, take two such vacations in such close succession? The movements of the president are, of course, followed closely by the press, who expect to know where he is and more or less what he is doing at any hour of the day. Yet on February 20th, for several hours, the press had no idea of his whereabouts. It was even rumored that he was dead. A press conference was hastily called to explain that he had to have an emergency dental treatment. Some years later, the dentist's family was questioned. They had a vague notion that something of the sort might have happened. A surprisingly casual attitude to what should have been a very memorable event. In May of 1954, a certain General Light, in company with some distinguished visitors, went to Muroc and wrote a letter after his visit describing how he had seen 5 separate and distinct extraterrestrial craft being studied by the Air Force, and confirming Eisenhower's visit. Unfortunately, virtually nothing is known about Light, though the letter he wrote undoubtedly exists. British UFO author Desmond Leslie also claimed to have spoken to U.S. Air Force personnel who confirmed Eisenhower's visit, and Frank Scully's widow, in support of her husband's maligned book, Beyond the Flying Saucers, stated that they once employed a carpenter who had at one time worked at the nearby Muroc base, and he too spoke of the presidential visit. An author collaborated with George Adamski, and an anonymous workman may not be the most convincing witness, yet their testimony is both independent and consistent. Faced with evidence that is at the same time so specific and so inconclusive, several theorists have suggested that the entire UFO phenomenon is a deliberate smokescreen put out by governments to conceal a more sinister truth. There was ironic confirmation of this in 1977, when on September 20th, the inhabitants of the Soviet city of Petrorovsk saw a jellyfish-like object in the pre-dawn sky. The immediate reaction of the witnesses was that it was a UFO, and the incident aroused great interest throughout the country and even abroad. The Soviet government, like other governments around the world, denied the existence of UFOs, yet here was a sighting it could not deny. And indeed, it could not, but for quite a different reason than the public supposed. For what witnesses had seen was the launching of the Cosmos 955 spy satellite from the secret base at Plesetsk. But this was, of course, an explanation the Soviet authorities could not reveal. Rather than break security, they had no choice but to allow the Russian public to go on believing that they had seen a UFO. Politically, it was better that it should be thought a UFO than one of their own secret devices. "The CIA has proof that UFOs exist," was the headline to an article in UFO Report in 1977, in which a former U.S. intelligence agent confessed that the CIA had deliberately suppressed evidence about UFOs. But suppose these leaks were themselves a part of the CIA's continuing campaign to distract attention from their own research projects. Such hypotheses are discounted by many people on the grounds that UFOs apparently display a technology so far ahead of any that we have achieved as to make it unlikely that such advances have been made in secret by any Earth government. But if UFOs are indeed of earthly origin, where is their base? In the Canadian forests, as one investigator has suggested? It seems improbable. Why are they seen in so many different forms and in so many different places? Why is there so many reports of occupants who are noticeably different than humans? There are countless objections to the homemade hypothesis. But there is also much supporting evidence. In the case of December 1980, 3 people, 2 middle-aged women and a child, driving in Texas, saw a huge glowing object from their car and stopped to look at it. They suffered burns severe enough to keep one of them in the hospital for a week. Whatever the object was, it was capable of emitting dangerous radiation at a considerable distance. This is the Cash Landrum incident, one of my favorites. Go back and check out episode 95. Shameless plug. Surely the U.S. government would not be experimenting with so dangerous a device in a public place, but if it was not operated by or with the cooperation of the U.S. military, why was it accompanied, as all 3 witnesses firmly testify, by some 23 helicopters of a type used by the U.S. Air Force? This case, the Cash Landrum case, is under active investigation by the Mutual UFO Investigation Network, MUFON. If that investigation reaches a clear conclusion, it could settle the question of UFO origins for some cases, if not for everyone, once and for all. Until then, it is a matter of weighing one explanation against another. But such stories, however improbable, are plentiful. There are far more than have been mentioned in these articles. While each one of them is at best a plausible anecdote, together they make up a coherent body of evidence that suggests that the U.S. government and possibly other governments elsewhere have in their possession devices that, whether they are extraterrestrial UFOs or super-secret military devices, these powers do not wish the public to know about. We cannot say for certain what is being covered up, but that a cover-up exists seems to be established beyond reasonable doubt. Home on the range. White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico is not far, by American standards, from Roswell, some 300 miles down U.S. Route 70. Since 1945, White Sands has launched no less than 30,000 assorted pieces of military hardware into the sky, among them the Lance missile. Are there any grounds for thinking that the 1947 Roswell saucer, or any other, came from White Sands? Ufologist William H. Spalding of Ground Saucer Watch believes so. Research by Ground Saucer Watch shows a disproportionately high number of unexplained high strangeness UFO sightings in New Mexico and its adjoining states. It is worth mentioning, too, the enormous range of items from early U.S. Air Force Snark cruise missiles to radar balloons and modified German V-2 rockets that White Sands handled even in the early days. Not all of these behaved like conventional rockets and could easily be mistaken for alien craft, especially as most firings were made at night until 1964. And as early as December 1946, a V-2 engaged in biological research was blasted 116 miles into space. One such test, carrying animals going awry, could form the single seed for all the pickled alien myths in ufology. And should such a crash result from an illegal test across state lines, there would be all the more reason to silence civilian witnesses. White Sands admits that some 7% of its tests are aborted, giving an average of more than one possible crash a week since the Second World War. Small wonder, then, that tales of UFOs and downed saucers abound in the southwestern United States. And that is the UFO Cover-up, according to The Unexplained from back in the 1980s. It's been a lot of pawns moved on the chessboard since then, but nothing has really come of it. We're still just as in dark about the UFOs as we were back in the 80s, I guess. But hey, thanks for listening. I really appreciate you. We'll see you again right here next week. God bless.